Welcome to the Unapologetically Jewish podcast. My name is Matthew Taub. We're going to try a bit of a new format today. Just me. We're going to talk about something that's really important. There's a word that can shut down a conversation almost instantly. Islamophobia. Question an Islamist organization and somebody says Islamophobia. Challenge Islamist propaganda, Islamophobia. Raise concerns about Islamist anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. Ask whether a political ideology is compatible with democratic values. And before anybody answers the actual question, suddenly you're defending yourself against an accusation of bigotry. And that's exactly what I want to talk about, because I'm done allowing an accusation to substitute for an argument. I am anti-Islamist. There, I said it. I'm not talking about banning Islam. I'm not talking about taking civil rights away from anybody. I am talking about Islamism, a political ideology that in its various forms seeks to give a particular interpretation of Islam a governing role in politics, law, or society. Political ideologies are open to scrutiny. They have to be. That's democracy. I can oppose communism. I can oppose fascism. I can oppose Christian nationalism. I can oppose white nationalism. I can oppose Marxism. I can oppose any political ideology whose ideas I believe are incompatible with the society I want to live in. So why does everybody suddenly become nervous when somebody says they oppose Islamism? Why? What exactly makes this political ideology different? I believe civil law in Canada must remain supreme over religious political authority. I believe men and women must have equal civil rights. I believe religious minorities must possess equal rights. I believe people must be free to practice a religion, leave a religion, change religions, or practice no religion whatsoever. I believe freedom of expression includes the freedom to criticize religion. I believe governments should not enforce theology. I believe blasphemy should not be a crime. And I believe democratic institutions must remain stronger than religious political movements. If an Islamist political movement disagrees with those principles, I'm allowed to oppose it. That is not Islamophobia. That's political disagreement. And if you believe my criticism is wrong, wonderful. Tell me why. That's how debate works. But don't change the subject. Don't accuse me of hatred and then pretend you've answered the argument. Show me where I've had the hatred. And if you can't, answer the argument. That's the standard. And this matters enormously to Jews because there is another reality we have become strangely uncomfortable discussing. Islamist anti-Semitism, it exists. This shouldn't be controversial. Far-right extremism and anti-Semitism exists. Neo-Nazi anti-Semitism exists. Conspiracy-driven anti-Semitism exists. Blood libel anti-Semitism exists. Anti-Semitism exists within parts of the radical left and the radical right. And Islamist anti-Semitism exists. If we're serious about fighting Jew hate, then we have to be prepared to identify every ideological source of it. No exemptions. But look at what we're doing instead. A synagogue is targeted, more security. A Jewish school is threatened, more security. A Jewish business is targeted, police investigation. Jewish students are intimidated, there's a statement. Politicians stand behind microphones and tell us that anti-Semitism has no place in Canada. How many times have we heard that sentence? Anti-Semitism has no place in Canada. Apparently it does, because it's here. And maybe instead of repeatedly telling Jews where anti-Semitism supposedly doesn't belong, we should start asking where some of it is coming from. Security guards don't fight anti-Semitism. They protect Jews from the consequences of anti-Semitism. Police cars outside synagogues don't fight anti-Semitism. Fences around Jewish schools don't fight anti-Semitism. Security grants don't fight anti-Semitism. They're necessary because something upstream has already gone terribly wrong. We are treating symptoms. We're throwing Tylenol at cancer. I want to start talking about causes. And Islamism is one of the ideological sources of anti-Semitism we have become afraid to examine openly. That distinction matters. But our fear of discussing it matters too, because the moment somebody identifies Islamist anti-Semitism, the conversation can suddenly become about Islamophobia. No. Answer the argument. If I say an Islamist organization has promoted anti-Semitic rhetoric, tell me whether the evidence is wrong. If I identify Islamist propaganda, tell me what I've misrepresented. If I say an organization here in Canada has ideological connections to a particular movement like the Muslim Brotherhood, challenge the connection. If I say an idea conflicts with liberal democracy, defend the idea. But don't tell me what supposedly exists in my head. Show me the hatred. If you can't answer the argument, and let's take the most obvious example. Hamas. Hamas didn't emerge from ideological vacuum. It emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood tradition. Its original 1988 charter didn't merely criticize an Israeli prime minister or Israeli government policy. It contained grotesque anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and religiously charged language concerning Jews. It made conspiratorial claims about Jewish power and influence. That is historical fact. Discussing it isn't Islamophobia. Studying the ideological origins of Hamas isn't Islamophobia. And examining Hamas propaganda isn't Islamophobia. Calling Hamas Islamist is not Islamophobia. And exposing anti-Semitism with this as Islamist ideology isn't Islamophobia. Then came October 7th. Jews were slaughtered. People were kidnapped. Families were destroyed. And something extraordinary happened almost immediately across the West. Instead of an enormous examination of the ideology of the perpetrators, the ideological interrogation turned towards Zionism. Israel went on trial. Zionism went on trial. Jewish identity went on trial. Jews thousands of kilometers away were suddenly expected to explain themselves. Jewish students were asked where they stood on Israel. Jewish institutions became protest targets, and Jewish businesses were labeled Zionist. And the word Zionist became one of the most useful linguistic tools in contemporary Jew hate. Because watch what happens when you change one word. Say, I hate Jews, and everyone knows exactly what that is. Say, I hate Zionists, and suddenly somebody wants to discuss political context. Say Jews aren't welcome here, and it's obviously anti-Semitic. Say Zionists aren't welcome here, and suddenly someone wants to explain why that's political speech. Targeted business because it's Jewish, and people understand the problem. Label it a Zionist business first, and suddenly somebody attempts to justify targeting it as activism. That's not an innocent linguistic shift. It creates a loophole. You take attitudes that would obviously be unacceptable if directed towards Jews, redirect them towards Zionists, and suddenly people pretend the anti-Semitism disappeared. I don't accept that. And I want to be very clear about anti-Zionism because somebody is going to try to catch me in what they think is a contradiction. They're going to say, wait, you're anti-Islamist, but you say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Isn't that hypocritical? No, because I don't accept the premise that anti-Zionism is simply legitimate criticism of an ideology. I believe anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Criticizing Benjamin Netanyahu isn't automatically anti-Semitic. Criticizing an Israeli government isn't automatically anti-Semitic. Creating Israeli policies isn't automatically anti-Semitic. Israelis do those things every day. But Zionism is fundamentally different. At its core, Zionism is the recognition the Jewish people have the right to national self-determination in our ancestral homeland. When your political position becomes that Jewish national self-determination itself should cease to exist, you aren't merely criticizing government policy, you are denying the Jewish people a right routinely claimed for other peoples. I call that anti-Semitism. Islamism is different. Islamism is not a people. Islamism is a country, and Islamism isn't national self-determination. Islamism is a political ideology about how society should be governed within Islam. Opposing Islamism doesn't require stripping anybody of a civil right. So no, I'm not accepting anti-Zionism as the comparison. The two propositions aren't equivalent. And there is something else we need to understand. None of this is theoretical. History has given us examples of what can happen when political movements fail to scrutinize Islamist movements because they share a common enemy or assume ideological differences can be dealt with later. Let's start with Iran. Iran in 1979 should be studied by anyone watching alliances between parts of the radical left and Islamist movements today. The revolution against the Shah wasn't exclusively Islamist. Liberals participated, nationalists participated, Marxists and communists participated, secular intellectuals participated, Islamists participated. They didn't share one vision of what Iran should become. They shared an enemy. And that distinction turned out to matter enormously. Parts of the Iranian left viewed Khomeini and his movement through an anti-imperialist lens. They opposed the Shah. They opposed American influence. Khomeini opposed the Shah. The enemy of my enemy. But once the Shah was gone, the question completely changed. It was no longer, what are we against? It became, what are we building? And suddenly, the differences mattered. What do you believe about secular government? What do you believe about political opposition? What do you believe about women? What do you believe about religious authority? What do you believe about dissent? What do you believe about freedom of expression? Those questions became very, very real. Khomeini's forces consolidated power. Liberal and secular opposition was progressively marginalized and suppressed. Left-wing movements were eventually crushed. The Tudeh Party, Iran's Communist Party, which had supported the revolutionary order for a period, was itself suppressed, with leaders and members both murdered and arrested. The lesson isn't complicated. Sharing an enemy doesn't mean sharing values. And that's a lesson parts of the Western left must remember. You can both oppose Israel. You can both oppose Zionism. You can both oppose American foreign policy. You can both talk about imperialism. You can both march together. Fine, go for it. But what happens after the march? What society do you actually want? That's the actual question. Because history tells us that shared enemies can create temporary alliances between movements with completely incompatible visions of society. Then look at Gaza. Hamas won Palestinian legislation elections in 2006. After its conflict with Fatah, Hamas seized control of Gaza in 2007. What followed wasn't simply conflict with Israel. Hamas also built an authoritarian governing system inside Gaza. Human rights organizations have documented arbitrary arrests, torture, repression of political opponents, and critics under Hamas authorities. In 2019, Palestinians took to the streets in protests known as We Want to Live. driven by economic hardship and living conditions. Hamas security forces cracked down. People were arrested. Demonstrators were beaten, some murdered. Journalists and human rights defenders were targeted. Why does that matter to this conversation, though? Well, because it demonstrates what should be obvious. Criticism of Hamas isn't automatically an attack on a population. It is criticism of an organization exercising political power. And when that organization represses dissent, we should be able to say so without somebody changing the subject to Islamophobia. Let's look at Egypt. The Arab Spring brought together Egyptians with radically different political philosophies around one objective. Hosni Mubarak had to go. Liberals were there, secular activists were there, Islamists were there, young revolutionaries, they were there. They shared a common enemy. Then Mubarak fell. And once again, the question changed. Now what? The Muslim Brotherhood became enormously powerful politically. Mohammed Morsi became president. Then, in November 2012, Morsi issued a constitutional declaration temporarily placing his decisions beyond judicial challenge. His opponents saw it as an extraordinary concentration of power. Liberal and secular opposition exploded. Egypt became intensely polarized. And then came another catastrophe. The military removed Morsi in 2013, and the government that emerged under Abdel Fattah el-Sisi became brutally authoritarian itself. So the lesson from Egypt isn't Islamists bad, military good. It's childish. The lesson is that overthrowing a common enemy tells you almost nothing about whether the people standing beside you share your vision of what should replace him. Again, shared enemy does not mean shared values. Now, let's look at Afghanistan. The Taliban returned to power in 2021, and we didn't have to guess what their political worldview meant once translated into government policy. Girls were progressively excluded from secondary education. Women were excluded from universities. Women's employment was heavily restricted. Freedom of movement was restricted. Independent journalism came under enormous pressure. Dissent became dangerous. Again, this isn't an abstract debate about whether somebody's interpretation of Islam offends me. This is political power. That's all this is. This is what happens when an ideology acquires the authority to govern. That's why ideological scrutiny matters before power is acquired. You don't wait until freedoms disappear before asking whether a movement believes in freedom. You don't wait until dissent is suppressed before asking whether a movement tolerates dissent. And you don't wait until women lose rights before asking what a movement believes about women. You don't wait until political opposition becomes dangerous before asking what a movement believes about democracy. You ask beforehand. You investigate beforehand. You challenge it beforehand. And when propaganda begins normalizing those ideas, you push back beforehand. That is why I refuse to accept Islamophobia as a conversation stopper. If I criticism Islamism, answer my criticism of Islamism. If I expose Islamist propaganda, answer the evidence. If I identify Islamist anti-Semitism, explain what I got wrong. If I question an Islamist organization, defend the organization. If I question whether a political idea is compatible with Canadian liberal democracy, defend the political idea. But do not change the subject by calling me an Islamophobe. An accusation is not an argument. And history gives us every reason to scrutinize political ideology before it acquires power rather than afterwards. Iran shows what can happen when people united by a common enemy ignore enormous differences over what should replace the system they're fighting. Gaza demonstrates what authoritarian Islamist government can mean for political dissent. Egypt demonstrates the danger of assuming movements standing together against an authoritarian government necessarily share a vision for what comes afterwards. Afghanistan demonstrates what can happen when an Islamist movement acquires enough power to translate its worldview directly into government policy. Different countries, different movements, different circumstances. I'm not suggesting they're identical. I'm really not, because they're not. But there is a recurring lesson. Don't confuse tolerance with ideological surrender. Don't assume that because you share an enemy with a movement, you share its values. Don't wait until an ideology acquires power before asking what it intends to do with said power. And don't allow accusations of bigotry to prevent legitimate scrutiny of political movements. That is not hatred. That's what democratic societies are supposed to do. And this is where the language of Islamophobia has become so effective as a conversation stopper. The moment Islamism is challenged, the argument is redirected away from the ideology and toward the supposed motives of the person challenging it. Instead of answering the criticism, attack the critic. Instead of defending the ideology, accuse the person of questioning it of prejudice. Instead of debating evidence, debate the person raising the evidence was allowed to raise it. I refuse to play that game. If I criticize Islamism, answer my criticism of Islamism. If I expose Islamist propaganda, answer the evidence. And if I identify Islamist anti-Semitism, explain what I got wrong. If I question an Islamist organization, defend the organization. If I question whether a political idea is compatible with Canadian liberal democracy, defend the political idea. But don't change the subject. Show me the hatred. And if you can't, answer the argument. And that's what I want people watching this to start doing. Push back openly. When you encounter Islamist propaganda, challenge it. When somebody glorifies Hamas, challenge it. When somebody romanticizes October 7th as resistance, challenge it. And when somebody repeats anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and libels, challenge them. When somebody uses Zionist as a socially acceptable substitute for Jew, challenge it. When somebody spreads historical misinformation about Jews, Israel, or Zionism, challenge it. When somebody tells you that Jewish self-determination is uniquely illegitimate, challenge it. Ask for evidence. Ask for sources. Know the history. Read organizations' own documents. Look at the leadership. Look at the affiliations. Look at their funding. That's what we do here, Unapologetically Jewish. Look at what people say to different audiences in English or in Arabic. Challenge propaganda with evidence and challenge historical lies with historical facts. Challenge ideology with argument. And when somebody responds by calling you an Islamophobe, don't spend the next 10 minutes defending yourself. Ask them one question. What specifically did I say that constitutes hatred? Then wait. Make them answer. If they can identify actual hatred or discrimination, address it. But if their answer is simply that you criticized Islamism, say, then answer the criticism. That's it. Don't let them move the goalposts. Don't allow an accusation to substitute for an argument. Don't allow the word Islamophobia to create an ideological force field around Islamism. Because political ideologies don't get immunity from scrutiny, simply because scrutinizing them makes people uncomfortable. Islamism is political ideology. We are allowed to examine it. We are allowed to expose it. And we are allowed to challenge it. We're allowed to oppose it. And when Islamist propaganda contributes to the demonization of Jews, Zionism, or Israel, we have an obligation to confront it. Not tomorrow, not after another synagogue needs another security guard, not after another Jewish school needs another fence, not after another Jewish business becomes a target. Before. That's the shift. Stop apologizing for asking legitimate questions. Stop allowing accusations to end legitimate conversations. Stop fighting only the manifestations of Jew hate while refusing to confront the ideological environments helping to produce them. We need to fight far-right anti-Semitism. We need to fight radical left anti-Semitism. We need to fight conspiracy-driven anti-Semitism. We need to fight blood libel anti-Semitism. We need to fight anti-Zionism because anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And yes, we need to fight Islamist anti-Semitism. No exemptions, no exceptions, no ideological sacred cows, no apologies for asking questions. Because I don't want a Canada where Jews simply become better protected targets. I don't want another fence, another guard. I don't want another police car. I don't want another politician telling me anti-Semitism has no place here after the next anti-Semitic incident. I don't want our organizations to build higher walls. I want us to have the courage to confront what is making those things necessary in the first place. And that means confronting propaganda before it becomes conventional wisdom. It means confronting ideological extremism before it acquires influence. It means refusing to allow Zionist to become a socially acceptable replacement for Jew. And it means refusing to allow the accusation of Islamophobia to silence legitimate criticism of Islamism and Islam. So the next time you're called an Islamophobe because you challenge Islamist ideology or Islamist propaganda, don't retreat. Don't apologize for an argument you didn't make. Don't let them tell you what you supposedly believe. Ask them this. What specifically did I say that constitutes hatred? And if they can't answer that question, bring them straight back to the issue they were trying to avoid. Show me the hatred. And if you can't, answer the argument. Because until we're prepared to confront the ideologies helping drive Jew hate, we're not actually fighting anti-Semitism. We're managing it. And I'm done managing it. Thank you for listening to the entire podcast. My name is Matt Taub, the founder and executive director of Unapologetically Jewish, a nationwide organization fighting anti-Semitism coast to coast. Thank you.